Hello and welcome to another episode of Topline Talks, a Mackie Myers podcast hosted by me, Owen Myers.
And me, Jenna Mackie.
As a finance and executive recruiter operating across multiple markets, the aim of this show is to bring inspiring stories and insights to our listeners from fascinating guests from across the leadership spectrum. Today, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Ray Eitel-Porter, who is the oracle of implementing AI in business from a practical governance and risk perspective. It is the question of the day. A lot of our customers are talking to us about what they're doing from an AI perspective, what are the risks, what are the opportunities. And we're talking to Ray as the beginning of a series that we will be running over the next 12 months of events and talks where we can bring our communities together to talk about the risks and opportunities of this. So Ray, thank you ever so much for giving up your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me and for that very warm welcome.
Excellent. Just before we really get into the nub of it, it'd be really amazing if you can try and distill, because the many things and achievements that you've had, a bit about your background, what you've done, and how you have become, such an expert on this topic.
Well, it's interesting because I actually studied languages at university. And when I was doing my course, as part of it, I spent a year abroad in Germany teaching English at a school. And the school finished, as German schools do, about 1:30 in the afternoon. And the school had just bought an Apple IIe computer for the pupils. And it was sitting there in the afternoons not being used. And so I asked the school if maybe I could use it during the afternoon to teach myself some coding. And that's when I got the bug about technology, writing a program actually for my dad's small shop to help him sort of run the shop. Since then, I've always been fascinated by the application of technology. And I think perhaps it's the background as a linguist that has helped me to kind of translate between deep tech and business people and sort of understand the application in a real world environment. I did found a software company at one point, and again, that was kind of the role that I was playing. I wasn't the person doing the coding, but I was sort of figuring out how you could use the coding in the real world.
Yeah,
I had a number of industry roles, and then we saw this big data arriving, and people started to really see the application of data and advanced analytics probably about 15 years ago or so. And that's when I went back into consulting and then joined Accenture to lead their what was then called analytics practice in the UK, which became data and AI as the techniques became more sophisticated. And then probably about 8 to 10 years ago, I started to see the emergence of data privacy, bias and fairness, and some of these risks that were associated with the use of AI. And that's where I then increasingly focused and became Accenture's global lead for responsible AI and AI governance. And about a year ago, I left Accenture primarily so that I could write my book because I wanted to get the message out to a broader range of people. And so I now have a part-time position with academia, do some freelance consulting work, and as I say, I've just finished writing this, which
there
arrived 2 weeks ago. The first copy from the publisher. So yeah,
amazing. And it's published end of October. This episode will probably go out at a similar time, to be fair. So
yes,
end of October.
Yeah, so it's very exciting and surprisingly topical right now.
Absolutely.
I seem to have hit the moment.
Well, we'll cover that a little bit later on. I'd like to really get into the crunch of it on a couple of items. So, if anyone who's listening is on a board in the C-suite running a division, and their investors, their managers or whatever are saying to them, right, what are we doing about AI? How are we implementing it? How are we managing it? How are we sort of going to get all this productivity gains that we've been promised? Where do you start?
So I think the first observation I would make is that you must start, right? I think there's no way that you can ignore it. It's not necessarily easy, but it's a little bit like suggesting that today, somebody who can't use a computer would have a good future in business or indeed in many other jobs. I mean, even if I look at, let's say, farming, farmers use a lot of computer technology to understand how better to manage their crops, etc. So AI is absolutely going to become a core part of our everyday. So every business really needs to think about it. But I do think there's a dramatic difference between what we read, which would suggest that every business is totally doing this and so on, and the reality which I see, which is actually most businesses are pretty cautious and quite careful in the approach that they take and are just taking the first steps really on the AI journey. That said, there are some companies that really are pushing ahead, and we can talk about some examples of that. I think where to get started is really to think about a manageable area where you could use AI, which will make a difference to the business. It can't be too trivial, but it shouldn't be the biggest problem that business faces, because that's too much to take on to begin with. And then think very practically about how could we potentially use AI to help in that particular area. And typically, people will start with addressing particular tasks or discrete activities. Probably to get the best value out of AI, you actually need to think transformation, because just taking little pieces of an existing process and trying to do them with AI is going to replicate many of the issues that may have been there in the existing process. And your bigger achievement will be if you actually take a step back and reinvent the process in the way that AI can do it very differently. But that's probably not where I would start. I'd start to experiment with some discrete examples. And then once you've built some capability, then think about, okay, what process could we re-engineer from start to finish with AI?
Yeah. And on that basis, we major in finance, right? So CFOs typically the custodians of an organization and making sure they're looking after their money and risks, etc. But it seems that there are two schools of thought. Either you can use it to save money, and there are some organizations that are looking at it solely through that lens, or you can use it to improve customer experience and improve outcomes in the product or service that you're kind of offering. But what do you see works best? Which sort of mindset is going to sort of win the day?
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. It can be very useful in both areas, frankly. I mean, customer service is probably the area where most companies are starting to experiment. I should just say that's particularly the case with generative AI. So one thing we often forget is that there are two fairly different types of AI. There's the traditional AI, as I call it, which we've had for a while. And then you have the generative AI, which essentially came with ChatGPT. I mean, it did exist beforehand, but it only really hit the scene with ChatGPT, where the AI actually creates new content, which is very different from traditional AI, which is essentially extrapolating patterns from historical data. And the generative AI in particular is being used, companies are starting to use that in customer service to improve either the way that a customer service agent might work. Many organizations had traditional chatbots on the website, but they were pretty limited and clunky often. Or generative AI can make them a lot more interactive. It can make them a lot more effective. Or it can be used as a helper. And I've seen a number of companies that use that very effectively, where it's essentially sitting alongside the human and is listening to the conversation and then making recommendations and advice. And that can be recommendations along the lines of kind of behavioral recommendations. So sort of saying, this person is showing signs of stress, or this person, you need to calm down a little bit or give them more time. So actually guiding them from a behavioral perspective. Or it can be recommending relevant products or service offerings, let's say, quicker than perhaps the human might be able to. So hearing what the customer is saying and then very quickly computing and saying, well, actually, this particular offering would suit that person really well.
Yeah.
And the human customer service agent will probably have a limited, vocabulary, if you like, of offers and things that they can remember, whereas the AI can look across the entire product spectrum and instantly come back with suggestions. But the human uses it then as an aid and not as a replacement.
Is it interesting? We actually had a guy on who was a co-founder of Google Cloud in Europe. Right. He's CPTO at a SaaS business at the moment, and he's very, very technical background. And he used the phrase which I loved, which was AI to the lay person, because obviously all the stuff that it's doing in life science discovery and all this sort of thing, a lot of people aren't going to interact with. But to the lay person, AI is the next evolution of a calculator. Does that resonate with you?
It does, absolutely. I would say calculator or then PC.
Yeah.
If you think about, maybe actually PC for me is slightly more accurate in the sense that a calculator is relatively limited to what you can do with it.
Yeah.
Whereas a PC, you can more or less do anything, right? There's so many different programs that you can put onto a PC to do different things. Access to the internet gives you all kinds of possibilities. And I think it's essential that people do learn to use this new tool, not be afraid of it, but learn how to use it carefully and wisely in their jobs and in their personal lives as well.
Just taking you back to what your point was earlier, obviously you started this kind of part of your career 8-9 years ago, but it definitely feels like it's this year specifically that AI has really boomed. But I think we've all known it's coming, and as you have said, you've been in it for 8 or 9 years now. Why specifically is it this year that it seems to have really taken off?
Yes, I asked myself that question as well, and I think the answer is actually ChatGPT.
Right.
So I started really trying to convince organizations that AI could help them in their business. This was before generative AI, so this was traditional forecasting and analytics, if you like, and then moving into sort of data science applications. And it wasn't easy because you were typically talking to senior executives who didn't have much experience of it, didn't have a background with it. Often at that point, you didn't have deeply technical people in the boardroom, even as CDOs or whatever. They often weren't at the board table. And so it was quite a hard job to convince business executives that this new sort of technology would really help them. ChatGPT came along, and suddenly you had lots of people just using it in their personal lives and looking at it and thinking, wow, this is actually pretty good, right? This is doing all these different things for me, answering these questions, etc. And so senior business executives started to say, we need some of this in the business. What then started to emerge, though, were some of the risks. So, we started to see the headlines of chatbots saying lots of different types of things that they shouldn't say, to customers, and other risk areas starting to emerge. And that's, I think, where organizations at the moment struggle a little bit. You've got, on the one hand, this vision that says we must use AI, which I totally agree with, and there's huge benefit. On the other hand, there's an understandable degree of caution because they've seen the risks and what can go wrong. And business leaders aren't used to living with significant amounts of risk. And so they're trying to sort of, reduce the risk down to a minimum. And that's actually quite difficult with generative AI in particular.
In taking that a bit further, so as you mentioned earlier, start small, but essentially we need to turn it into a transformation type approach. Who in the organization should be part of that conversation and driving it and responsible for it, particularly with a view on sort of risks, data management, governance?
So I think the most important thing is that you really do need to involve everyone across the organization. And it's not just a technical problem or a legal problem or an HR problem or whatever. So I've worked with many organizations that spend the first few months of a project just getting all the different functional leads, et cetera, together and then trying to figure out who's going to lead. And my view there would be the most important thing is somebody who's passionate about it and who has frankly, the budget and the clout to actually bring everyone together, get them working as a team. But then, of course, you need clearly allocated responsibilities across the team. What's the risk team going to do? What will legal do? Where do the technical people fit in? Security, cybersecurity, information technology, etc. They will have an important role, but you don't want duplication. So you need to be very clear about kind of the boundaries and the handoffs, etc. between the different groups.
Yeah. Where are you seeing it? I don't know whether you can give case studies, examples, but where are you seeing it being done very successfully, and sort of any sort of particular learns or pitfalls to avoid?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of examples from my book. So one is Vodafone, who used generative AI in their Voxy customer service agent. And, they went through a very careful and deliberate process of testing, great amount of testing to make sure that this was going to be, under control and wasn't going to say the wrong kinds of things to customers. And it's definitely helped the customer service agent to be much more helpful and real and so forth, but within very carefully defined sort of boundaries. Another interesting example, and I'm sure we'll get on to talking about AI agents because that's kind of the other big buzzword at the moment, but is the advertising company WPP. So as you can imagine, they write copy and come up with images for lots of different companies around the globe in all kinds of different industries. And whenever they do something, a new campaign, they have to look at it through multiple different lenses. Are we going to offend this particular group of people in this country? There are legal considerations in different countries, which are all different. They have created an army of agents, AI agents. Each agent is trained to represent a different perspective.
Amazing.
So you might have the agent that is focused on kind of the environment and green considerations, and then another one that is more from a female perspective, one that's different perspectives, and they will run any new copy through these different agents. The agents all look at it and say, well, this word's going to offend my group of people, and then those different perspectives surface, and then there's an agent that sits on the top that will try to kind of reconcile and make changes so that it's suitable for everyone.
That is fascinating. And I guess that answers the question a lot of the time, because I think a lot of the question mark around risk is where's the source and where's the information actually coming from. But obviously if they've created the agent themselves, they must be very clear that they're very comfortable with like the source of the information that's being provided.
Yes, exactly. And I'm sure that there are lots of human checks as well, right? I mean, I think that one of the key things that we have to do with a good AI governance process is really think about the level of risk. So there are some uses of AI which are going to be not particularly risky. And there you want to just get on with it and apply some checks and controls, but not overdo it. There are other uses which might be very high risk. Let's think life sciences, medicine, credit lending, whatever. And there you're going to do lots and lots of checks to make sure that the AI is within bounds. And depending on the type of AI that you're using, you may well still have a human check and sign off. So we're not necessarily looking at replacing people, but we're looking at speeding things up, making people more productive by doing some of the work, and then having a human look at it and review it.
Your point about replacing people is obviously one of the biggest, arguments or contentions that people have at the moment is, where's the balance between the two? What's your view on that specifically?
Well, I think at the moment, AI is primarily at the stage where it's very good at taking on particular tasks or activities, but not entire jobs. So I think the current sort of evolution, you will see, and there are more and more studies coming out that show that people's productivity can be increased by 10, 20, 30% by using AI for particular things that they do. And they're typically things that aren't particularly interesting either. So they're things that people aren't that unhappy about losing as part of their, activity.
Yeah.
Just take the very simple one about taking meeting notes and something like that. I don't think anybody really enjoys doing that particularly, but it's important and necessary.
Yeah.
But having the AI that does the meeting notes, you need to check it because it's not always 100% accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another big issue that we're going to have to deal with, which is people become over-reliant on the AI, assume it's correct, and that isn't always the case. But I do think that over time, AI will encroach more and more on existing human jobs. But it's then really important that people understand how to work with the tools and move on to do other things, because new jobs will be created for people. And that's what we need to, really focus on. Companies need to offer that kind of training and reskilling to people so the workforce isn't nervous and afraid about it, is able to embrace it. That will help the company as well, because the more people you've got using it and trying it, etc., then ideas will percolate up, and the whole workforce will become much better at using these new tools.
Onto agentic stuff that you referenced earlier. And I guess with a view about regulation, how much, either from an industry perspective or internally within a company, how tight do you need to be on regulation and governance in your view as this continues to explode?
So maybe two parts to that question: the agentic piece and then the governance piece. I'll start with the governance piece. My view is that we absolutely need self-governance from organizations at the moment, because there are significant differences in the regulatory environment in different regions and different countries. And regulation typically moves much slower than technology and innovation. But companies need to be comfortable and confident in their use of AI. And I strongly believe that self-governance is not actually an inhibitor to the use of AI. Quite the opposite. It's the tool that makes you feel confident and able to sleep at night, knowing that you are using AI, but you're doing all the right kinds of checks so that you're as comfortable as you can be that it's going to go right and not go wrong.
Yeah.
And that's, regardless of regulation, yes, you need to be careful of regulatory constraints. And even if you don't have blanket laws, like the EU now has a blanket horizontal regulation for AI, the UK doesn't. The UK is taking more of a vertical sector-specific approach. But the UK is relying on existing laws, and there are many laws which are applicable to AI. Just because it's AI, it doesn't mean you can't discriminate against, people. We've had non-discrimination laws for a long time. They apply to AI just like anything else. So you can take those sector-specific approaches. But obviously the other big thing companies are cautious about is reputational damage. Right? There's the legal risk, but there's the reputational risk. And putting in place a robust self-governance program that really looks at every potential use case of AI, asks the question, is this an appropriate use case? Are we going to get value out of it? And what would the risks be? What could the risks be of using AI in this situation? And as I said before, if it's very low risk and sort of trivial, fine, just get on with it. But if you think this is a more high risk area, then you need to go through very rigorous testing and checks and so forth, and then assess at the end of the day, what's my risk benefit analysis? And, there will be some risks that remain. There'll be some residual risk. But is that worth it against the gains that we're going to get? Then turning to your second point about agents. So agents are definitely what will bring more value from AI, because the difference between an AI agent and AI as we have it at the moment, either traditional AI or generative AI, is that a chat GPT or whatever it is, and I reference that, but that's obviously not the only version of
others do exist. Yeah.
Others do exist, absolutely. It will come back and it will tell you things, and it will make recommendations, it will do bits of work for you, but it won't go out and actually take actions on your behalf. actually the latest version can do, right? So that's where we're moving into agentic. But the key point about agentic is it can make your shopping list, but it can then actually go to, online retailer. It can place the order. If you've given it the credit card details, it can literally make the order and have the order delivered to home. That's fabulous because that really is achieving a lot more, but you can immediately see how that could go much more wrong, right?
Yeah.
It could make a mistake, in the order. So it's that balance, and actually the risk goes up dramatically once you give it the power of agency.
Yes, interesting. I should have visions of getting 100 bananas delivered or something.
Yeah, same. My brain went, oh my gosh, that's actually amazing. And then the immediate next thing was, but they've got my credit card details. And what if they get the order wrong? And what if I spent £2,000 on Ocado rather than like whatever it is that you wanted it to spend? So yeah, it feels very real, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we can make that kind of mistake too, right? I once ordered 12, what I thought was 12 nectarines, but it was actually 12 packets of 6 nectarines. We had a lot of nectarines at home.
Yeah.
Right? But, the agent could do exactly the same thing, and it could do it many, many times.
Yeah.
Could order 100 packets instead of 12 packets, and then you've got a real problem.
Yeah.
So a question I was going to ask is, how do you identify the right problems? So if you for an organisation to tackle, so your advice is start small. Probably look at the things which actually are not that exciting for the main workforce to be doing, and then build from there.
Build your capability.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think they need to be not too exciting, but they need to be exciting enough, because if they're trivial, then people will say, well, what was the point of that? So you want to pick something that people will notice and say, oh, actually, that's really quite useful. But isn't necessarily the biggest single challenge that's facing you at the moment.
And for an organisation that doesn't have the budget of Vodafone or other international conglomerates, that's quite small and growing, but wants to adopt and generate the value from this, how do you install a culture of ongoing AI transformation when you're actually not used to having that approach because you don't have the resources or the capability particularly?
I think a lot of that comes back to training and getting the workforce comfortable with what AI can actually do, letting people use it in their day-to-day work and find the opportunities in their work for applying it. You need to help people understand how to use it and what the risks might be of using it, because it's not always obvious, to people where things could go wrong. But then let them experiment, let them try things out within a certain, number of guardrails. So simple things like don't use a public version of one of these chatbots to put company confidential information in. You need to have a corporate version if you're going to use it for corporate information.
Yeah.
Things like this that are not too difficult to establish as policies. You need obviously some technology behind it to have a corporate version, but that's perfectly possible also for small companies and for medium-sized companies. So I think it needs somebody who is both an enthusiastic believer in the art of the possible, but is also cognizant of the risks and who can therefore give people that opportunity, but also explain to them where they need to be careful.
Yeah. I guess plugging your book, which is due out in a few weeks, as we referenced earlier, can you talk to us a little bit, I guess, the purpose of the book, but then also specifically maybe talk about risks people really need to be aware of? I mean, bias, data protection, probably being the key ones. And bring that to life a little bit as to, again, the practical things people should be thinking to tackle those key sorts of things.
So the book is really designed as a kind of practical roadmap for, let's say, the example you just gave of this person who is looking to lead the use of AI within a company, but also is responsible for making sure that is done safely and in a way that isn't going to get people into trouble. And it lays out a process that you could go through for setting up governance within an organization. And there are examples from many different companies through the book that sort of show how they've done that. It can very much be adjusted to the size of the organization. As you say, not everyone is as big as a WPP or a Vodafone or whatever. So you can very much sort of scale down what you need, but the principles remain the same. The foundational structure is going to remain the same. So you typically will want to start with some principles. Those want to be tied to any kind of values that you have as a company. So as you can imagine, a life sciences company has a different set of values to a mining company or to a financial services company. They're not diametrically opposed, but there'll be a focus which is different in different industries. So you want to tie it into your industry to make it real for people. You probably translate those principles into a few policies. Most companies will have some policies. So those are the sort of the legal bit that makes sure that people do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But then more importantly, beneath that, you will benefit from having some operating procedures or standards or something that's a little bit more detailed that explains to people, okay, this is actually how you go about doing things. So let's take the example of bias and fairness that you mentioned. It's fine to say we're going to be fair to our customers, but what does fair actually mean? And when it comes to using AI, as indeed with other situations, there are lots of different ways you can define fairness. And it's not fair to leave it up to the data scientist or the person who's writing an algorithm to determine what the definition is. The company needs to have its standards or its approach to deciding those things at an appropriate level within the organization. So some sort of document that outlines an approach that you can take and where you go to for advice at a more senior level if you're struggling with some of these questions. Obviously that explains some of the technical procedures you should do and things you shouldn't do and so on. The heart of it then becomes actually identifying where AI is being proposed for use, either because someone's thinking of building something internally or they're thinking of buying in from the outside, which is increasingly going to be a big area because most technical things that you buy from third-party companies have AI in these days, and you want to be assured that the third-party company is doing the right things. And that's often the hardest part within an organization is actually nailing all the places where AI could pop up. And I always say, go and look for the budget because typically you need money to do things, either buy from outside or to develop something inside. Somebody's team's got to be allocated, a person's got to be allocated. So if you can find where the money's being allocated and then ask at that point, is this allocation of funds going to involve AI? If yes, then we should ask some questions to determine the potential level of risk. And if it's higher risk, then we should do much more, detailed analysis to understand the risk. And then kind of sitting beneath that, you've got building out the capabilities within the organization. So training, some documentation, because there are regulators, et cetera. So you should be documenting where AI is being used. And if you've done tests, et cetera, you need to keep records of that in case there were ever a problem. And indeed, so that you can learn from it going forwards, so you know what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, to take it to a recruitment context, because we are a search organisation, we're constantly trying to identify. I think actually, where is it going to be really good? Where is it less good? But for us as a small organisation, as an example, we're not going to be developing our own stuff. We're going to be buying stuff in. But then there's a lot of products and services that are coming to market. Then actually, when you peel back the layers a little bit, there's not a huge amount there, and you're asking, where's the data source? Like, where are you actually, And it's so. I think for smaller organisations, whether it's the recruitment sector or many others, I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge as well, as to really get into the crux of, how authentic and how much can you actually sort of trust what's going on behind the scenes, particularly for people that are non-technical.
Very much so. The Bank of England put out a report actually towards the end of last year that suggested that third-party risk is going to be the largest and is the fastest growing area for AI. That was financial services oriented, but it applies to other sectors. DCIT put out a very good roadmap for third-party assurance recently, and there's quite a focus within the government on trying to build a third-party assurance sort of ecosystem in the UK, which would give organizations more confidence about bringing in potentially a third-party assurer, or indeed if you're a supplier, you might go to a third-party assurer to have them, validate your product or service before you start selling it. And then the customers can look at it and say, oh, okay, this third-party independent assurer has done these tests and these are the results, so we can be more confident that this product's okay.
Yeah.
That's quite reassuring because, as Owen says, I mean, particularly as like founders, we get a lot of inbound, sales collateral sent to us, and AI is probably one of the biggest ones at the moment. And I think just having this conversation brings it to light of how protected is our data and all those sorts of questions, because we won't do it in-house. We'd have to do it outsourced. And is there any questions right here, right now, before that kind of assurance layer comes through that we should be asking these businesses before, not just us, any business for that matter? What sort of questions should we be asking to give ourselves the reassurance that it's safe and we're de-risking as much as possible?
So certainly you need to be very careful about what's happening to your data. Is the provider of the solution, are they going to use your data for their own training purposes? What kind of access and what kind of plans do they have for your data?
Right.
Is it being shared with others? How do they segregate data within their systems to keep your data separate from anybody else's data? And what kind of security controls, et cetera, do they have to make sure they're not going to get hacked or compromised or something like that? So data is definitely one of the key concerns. Then I think another one in recruitment in particular would be bias. And bias is actually really difficult. In the use of sort of traditional AI techniques, a lot of work has been done on how you measure for bias and minimize the amount of bias, both in data sets that are used for training and in the models themselves that are developed. So in that area, a lot of work exists. But in the generative AI space, it's still very nascent because we don't know exactly how these foundation models were trained, what data sets they used, etc. So it's very difficult there to be confident about the amount of bias that might come through. And you continually see new examples of people who've been sort of stress testing generative AI models, and it's very easy for them to produce very biased outputs. It doesn't take a lot at all. And obviously in recruitment, that's really huge. Really, really important. The other challenge is that the third-party companies are often quite reluctant to share detailed information about the data they use to train and the models themselves because they see that as their IP. And so I know a lot of companies that kind of struggle with that. And some larger companies do then actually go to a third party and say, look, well, okay, if you're not going to give us access, will you give access to this third-party assurance firm to look at your company? We will tell the third-party assurance firm what our big concerns are, and then they will go and test for that. As a smaller company, that's probably not feasible. But I think what will happen actually is that we will gradually over time see people who want to sell solutions going independently to these people, getting those reports done in advance because they will want the evidence to take to their customers to say, look, you can trust us because company XY that is a trusted company has done all these tests, they've looked at our data, etc. But it's tough at the moment.
Well, we're still very early. I guess there's a long way to go. We've run out of time, so I've got two final quickfire questions just to wrap up the session. The first is, I mean, we could be here for another couple of hours at least, but how do you see AI evolving in the next 3 to 5 years?
I mean, in AI terms, that's a long time, right? 3 to 5 years. I mean, if you just think ChatGPT is only a couple of years old, and it's already dramatically improved in terms of its capability. I think we will see more and more use of AI within the workplace and in consumer products. And we will see agents gradually starting to emerge, although I think that will be slower and they'll be quite carefully controlled. So if we go back to my sort of shopping example, you could imagine that agent being very helpful, but you're probably going to want checkpoints in there so that it comes back to you at each step in the process and says, well, here's the shopping list I prepared. Is that okay? And then here's the here's the basket. Before I press order, do you want to take a look at what's in the basket before I actually commit? And so those kinds of things I think will be useful and will definitely start to happen.
But I guess who knows, right? I guess when the internet started becoming more mainstream, I doubt people thought in 10 to 15 years after that people will be able to check into a flight on their mobile phone. Yeah, do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So I guess it could go in many different directions.
The other area I think we will start to see more developments is in what they call embodied AI, which is basically robots.
Yeah.
And those starting to move kind of out of factory settings and into more everyday settings around us. And that will be a big change.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you ever so much for your time. Fascinating insight. Good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
And you're due to be joining us on a couple of our networking events and collaborations that we're doing over the next little while. So I'm sure we'll hear some more fascinating insights. But for now, really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. It was an interesting discussion.
Thank you. For those listening again today, you know where to find us. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. But for now, that has been Topline Talks.